Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this SecurityBoulevard.com program brought to you by TechStrong and ThreatX. My name is Cody. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning, and we have an exciting program ahead. First, I do need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. Over on that right side of the screen, you'll see a couple more options. There's the chat tab, and we'd like you to use that for more general comments. So go ahead and start warming that up for me and let me know from where you are joining. We will be launching a couple of polls throughout our program today, so please do respond to those when they pop up on your screen. If you click on the Handouts tab, you'll find a couple of resources have been uploaded there. Feel free to download those at your own leisure. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of our program. So the title today is Botnets, DDoS, and Deception, the 2023 API Threat Landscape. And I'm joined by Jeremy Ventura, Field CISO for ThreatX, and Brett Settle, co-founder and chief strategy officer at ThreatX. So Jeremy and Brett, thank you both so much for joining me today. Jeremy, do you want to go ahead and get us kicked off with the agenda?
Absolutely. Thanks again, Cody, for having myself and Brett today. And thanks everyone from joining from around the world. I see we've got people in from Rio, Netherlands, Toronto. So super exciting. And we're both excited to be here. So as Cody mentioned, my name is Jeremy Ventura. I am the Field CISO and Director of Security Strategy for ThreatX. My background is I've worked for many different vendors, from email security, vulnerability management, incident response. I've also worked in internal security, working for some pretty large security operation centers and help leading different government's risk and compliance programs, and also security overall arching architecture. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my partner in crime today, Brett Settle.
Yeah, I'm Brett Settle, and great to be here today. My background's kind of a mix, so I've worked on both the vendor side of the equation, both in startups and mid-size software companies, as well as large organizations where I had multiple roles in both application development, CTO, and most importantly to this topic, responsibilities for security and CISO roles in those organizations. So kind of a mixed bag, but certainly a lot of applicable information for the topic at hand today. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Brett. And I think for everybody, before we get started into the agenda and today's presentation, just a little bit of background of the company that Brett and I both work at. So ThreatX is an API protection platform company. And what we really solve to do is block real-time threats when it comes to web apps and APIs. That could be anything from DDoS attacks to botnet attacks to your typical OWASP API top 10, such as credential stuffing, SQL injection. We actually wrap that platform around with a managed service that is able for you to outsource your security operations when it comes to APIs and web apps to us. So there are definitely handouts, as Cody had mentioned earlier, inside the platform for you to download, and feel free to check us out at ThreatX.com. But without further ado, let's get into it. So today's agenda, we really want to cover 3 topics. The first is understanding really where the API threats are today. So where do we look in 2023? Obviously, we've got some pretty recent large news with some incidents and breaches that are happening in today's world, but also taking a look at some of the case studies. So getting a little technical and talking about where are the threats evolving from. It's not your typical just single point and attack anymore. Attackers are expanding and evolving their tactics and techniques. And so what do you need to look out for? And lastly, kind of the best tips and recommendations on where should you start? Where should you go when it comes to protecting your APIs and really the crown jewels of your business? So without further ado, we'll begin the presentation. And as Cody mentioned, feel free, Brett and I both love to answer questions. So in the chat, feel free to post any questions or commentary that you have as we present this presentation today. So without further ado, APIs. So most of us on the call know what an API is, or an application programming interface, but why are they becoming so increasingly used by organizations? Well, there's a couple different areas and why. And I think the first thing is really understanding that the world and the digital world runs everything on APIs. Pretty much every modern application uses an API or actually is an API in itself. And this explosive growth has really been accelerated because organizations are going kind of that buzzword through digital transformation or moving to the cloud, for example. And these initiatives really allow development, engineering, and the business in general to develop faster, to be able to expand into different areas of business, but also be able to connect to other internal processing tools to make things more efficient for employees, but also being able to interact with other external vendors and companies and products to make sure that data is flowing. And again, business is ever increasing. So with this, though, also comes a challenge, as we know. As APIs grow, APIs are also pretty vulnerable, and they're not necessarily easy to protect by nature. And when we think about this, a lot of it comes down to visibility. You know, when Brett and I are talking to a lot of different customers and prospects alike, a lot of the times it really starts with visibility. Do I have access, or do I even know what is in my environment? Where are my APIs? Who owns those APIs? What is their intention? What is their use? And it's a real struggle because we have things such as rogue and zombie APIs, which is really APIs that were created for maybe a purpose back in the day, but were never decommissioned, or they're shadow, meaning they don't know they even exist. But also with that, we're also seeing API vulnerabilities more and more increasingly come out. One that comes top of the mind is, you know, vulnerabilities that are addressed that allow attackers or hackers to come in and be able to attack organizations. Again, I just mentioned recently in the news, we have one of the world's largest telecommunications company just this past week in the news. Now, still a lot more detail to come through there, but from what it looks like, it was just an API that was out there that had access to PII information, such as name and home address. And, you know, again, more information to come, so we can't speculate too soon on this, but 37 million records were lost. And while somebody might say, oh, it's just names, it's just emails, we can get that from, you know, any, dark net, web-based, and get that. It's becoming a serious problem where we're seeing organizations not only losing access to information, but it's really hurting brands' reputations. Never mind the compliance regulations that potentially could be targeted at this. So as we look at this expansion growth, it's also really important to understand where those attacks are coming from. So as we mentioned before, we have traditional OWASP top 10 that we've always kind of known for the industry, right? We've got the BOLA attacks, or broken object level access. We've got injection, misconfigurations. But what we're starting to see is attackers are expanding. They're becoming a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more involved. And one of the things that we're seeing is these attack patterns are starting to combine multiple different avenues to target organizations. There's a couple different reasons why. A lot of it could be distracting a security team to go and focus in one area while they're actually probing another part of a business or a server or an application. And also from there, right, what that allows attackers to do is gain valuable insight and information. I think the game here, very similar to what we call APT attacks, is the low and slow, right? Can I get into an organization undetected and go at that and to get the crown jewels, right? To get the information that we want. So we're going to talk a lot more about what these attacks are, where we're going. We'll actually share some use cases from our actual ThreatX team about kind of how we're stopping these incidents from happening to organizations. So Brett, I'm actually going to turn it over to you. I actually mentioned a little bit around multi-mode attacks and really coming in from different avenues, but do you want to elaborate just a little bit further on kind of what we're seeing, this new evolution of sophistication?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it even on the prior two slides, but the challenges with the APIs, honestly, is some of the same challenges we saw with applications, but the visibility aspect and the fact that those APIs were built to be reused by multiple clients means that oftentimes, you know, shortcuts will be taken and or optimizations are taken that overexpose certain sets of data, and or just from a visibility, it becomes harder and harder for especially security teams to understand if those APIs are being used properly. And because of that, we're seeing just a tremendous increase in the number of both discovery as well as attacks that we're seeing on the APIs directly. Simple examples would be, you know, login and authentication type scenarios where there may be a web component that's expected to be used, but the probing is being done to identify the underlying APIs behind the scenes. and then targeting those APIs. And it ranges from utilizing, botnets to kind of distribute the load across multiple IPs to diversionary tactics, as you said, where they may actually, launch DDoS level attack as a diversionary tactic while they intersperse various discovery techniques that they're using as well. And so I just think that there's a lot more tools that are available for the attackers. And the fact that APIs are much more murky when it comes to understanding how they're being utilized makes them the prime target for these types of attacks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a great, overview and kind of definition of kind of what we're seeing and how that evolution is starting to happen. This is actually kind of a good segue. We've got a couple poll questions today, and one of the poll questions I'm going to launch right now, but it comes back to something I mentioned earlier, is really around visibility and making sure you know kind of what you have in your environment. And so the first poll question here is, how many APIs, a guesstimate, do you have in your environment? And this would be internal APIs, so meaning APIs that help connect systems to each other, maybe a payroll system to an HR system, versus external APIs. So maybe APIs that your company publishes out there to connect to other tools. And I think, as we kind of let this question come in and people respond, it's really interesting because I think a lot of times in cybersecurity, we kind of start at this place of visibility. We start in this place of asset management, and it's hard. There is no real secret answer to this. Tools and techniques and technologies can help, of course, but a lot of that comes down to also ownership. And I think when we talk about APIs, and I know we've talked about this in a couple of different webinars in the previous, but a lot of this also comes down to ownership. So who owns that API? Who owns that application that's sitting in front of the API, for example? And so as we start to see this, I'm going to actually pull this up so everybody can see kind of what's happening right here. But it looks like I'm actually, the first thing, I don't know about you, Brett, but the first thing I look at is actually the bottom one in dark purple, where about, a quarter of individuals are saying, I don't know. And that's okay, right? That's very common of what we're seeing, where a lot of times individuals don't know or organizations don't know. And there's tools and technologies, again, as I mentioned, that can help with that. But Brett, do you have any advice when it comes to specifically visibility?
Well, I think those are table stakes. I actually saw a question popping up in the chat as well. And it's a lot of the products that are on the marketplace right now, they have some form of API catalog and API discovery component into it. Now, I'll throw out a stat, and I've heard some of the other competitors throw it out as well. On your chart there, more than 50% of the people are saying they have less than 100 APIs. I'd say pretty consistently, once we get in with our customers and we start doing the discovery, it's 8 to 10 times the number of APIs they thought that they actually had and that were exposed externally. And that's simply just due to the nature of, APIs and they're built for reuse. And the good news is a lot of developers take advantage of that reuse. But it also means that they're oftentimes building a lot more APIs than you think that they're building. And many of those APIs are getting exposed. So, I think the challenge is very much how do you initially get a good understanding? And it's not always just what's in the schemas. Over and over again, when we talk with, customers and specifically security teams, the trust level that the schemas are up to date, that they're fully inclusive, that they're fully descriptive in terms of how those APIs are to be used and what authentications and authorizations and components of the API are there. There's just, again, the nature of the beast in business. We all are moving very quickly, and it's very difficult to keep all those things completely up to date. And so the challenge is very much one of first understanding how big is the problem, and then how do you actually maintain pace, because it's always growing as we continue to move forward in this new digital age.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, something that kind of tags along to not just APIs, but kind of taking a step back and even looking at a 30,000 foot view of security in general. As we know, a lot of the tools out there that organizations are using are producing a high alert or high volume of alerts, and organizations can't keep up, right? The tools aren't necessarily doing a great job to, let's say, prioritize what to focus on. But in addition to that, there's even resource and allocation issues with security teams, making sure they have the right bandwidth, right? The right personnel to understand what's happening, or to be able to even just never mind respond, to even understand what's going on, right? Is this something that I need to focus on? Is this something I need to look at? Is this a normal behavior or pattern part of my organization. And so we're seeing a lot of challenges as well, where just it comes down to not just the technology again, but also the personnel, right? Budgeting, resource allocation, all kind of tied together.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a good segue. And I didn't want to forget about this. I know you mentioned it as well. But when we start to think about multi-vector attacks, as we mentioned, or attacking an organization with different phases or different techniques, one of the common ways, and you'll see this a little bit later in some of our use cases, is a lot of times the attacker is using bots. And what's interesting about this is when it comes to bots, I think a lot of times people assume bots right away are just always bad, right? Oh, bot's bad. But there are actual good bots out there. And attackers know this. And attackers are leveraging how to bypass certain bot solutions, right? I know, Brett, you and I talk a lot about solver services. Yep. And having bot solutions that most of them have already been cracked, right? And so attackers know that. They're going on the dark net and they're saying, I want to set up a little botnet army and I want to go just probe an organization or probe a server. And what's interesting about this is most technologies that are out there today, these point solutions, aren't picking it up because the bots are actually normalized, or they're working in a normal fashion that these existing solutions can't pick up. And so what we're starting to see is a lot of this as well is also pretty, I'll call it static in sense, where you see kind of a flow come in, is this good or bad? And then the solution says, okay, it's good, let it go through, or it's bad, let it go through. But what's happening is you're not really seeing a lot of correlation of data. And so I know we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. But Brett, from your experience, I know you've been in this space for a while. Bots, right? Bots are an interesting one because there are point solutions. You see vendors acquiring bot companies to kind of put it part of their portfolio. But is there actually a perfect solution to stopping bots?
Well, I think my perspectives on this are that a lot of customers kind of change out bot solutions every year or two. And part of that is the solver services that we talked about. If you're a really high value customer and you've got something out there, chances are there's a solver service out there for whatever solution that you're using. And so you become very frustrated with the solution because it keeps getting cracked almost immediately with each revision or each release. And then, step two is you move to the next one. Things look kind of rosy for a few months. And then the bad guys catch on to who you're using this time. And now they're kind of back to the fast pace at which they're keeping up with the enhancements made to that bot solution. The real challenge that we kind of see with a lot of the approaches is exactly what you said. They're good at certain pattern recognition. What they're not as good at as kind of the dynamic flow, the whack-a-mole that we're all familiar with, which is, even if it's not a solver service, just by sheer nature of once an attacker realizes that the solution that's picking up the attack across the IPs has keyed in on something that allows it to be effective, well, then they start modifying it. And it really comes down to whatever bot solution that you're using, its flexibility and its ability to continuously be dynamic, identifying what elements are consistent, but also as they start to anonymize or vary those components, what elements are different, but still could be key indicators that it's the same person. And then how do you correlate that data together so that you can see kind of the full extent of the attack? And again, we'll get into some cases, some pretty interesting, fun ones that we've dealt with, from our security operations team that will kind of highlight some of those challenges as well. So,
perfect, awesome. And actually, before we get into that, I think this is a good kind of segment that we talk a lot about in the industry, API security in general. And I think unanimously, I know you and I both agree, and we've talked to a lot of prospects and customers, and I actually see some stuff in the chat already, that it can be pretty confusing. And I think when we think about API security, there's a challenge there because we do have a lot of vendors saying many different stories, whether it is, let's deploy inline, or let's deploy out of band, and the pros and cons of each, or even something simple as you need to focus on shift left, or vendors that say you need to integrate in the CI/CD pipeline, or you need to do scanning, you need to look at attacking in real time. And we actually have a good question in the chat here, and I think it's a good segue where the question says there's many products in the space that seem to be good at discovering and detection, but there's no real blocking or mitigating at layer 7. And are you guys different? And so I'll start, Brett, and then of course Obviously, you being the co-founder, right? I want to kind of go into your story about kind of why and how you created ThreatX. And we are different because ThreatX specifically, we do include real-time blocking inside of our platform. And Brett will talk a little bit about how we were created and why it kind of started that way. But it actually gives us a huge competitive differentiator. And because what we're seeing now is it's like anything. You can spend a lot of money for a tool or a little money, or you can outsource it. But at the end of the day, what do you do with the data, right? And so as solutions might become more and more evolved or sophisticated, what's difficult is the analyst that's sitting behind the screen. And they've now got to figure out, where do I start to prioritize? What's my risk score? What's the risk of the business? Do I shut down this API? Do I take it offline? Do I try to modify this and potentially break an application, which we've seen a lot? So Brett, I kind of teed you up there, but do you want to just give a little bit of a background on, why did you create ThreatX from your background, or help create it with your other co-founder, and kind of what makes us different in the market?
Yeah, and I'll try to be succinct because we go in 90 different directions. But I mean, I think that question somewhat hits the nail on the head in terms of our frustrations. We were at the time using, more of the traditional WAF solutions that are legacy in nature and really static signature based, looking at a single request and trying to match a pattern and then make a blocking decision based on that single request. And, the world has moved on. The applications are far more sophisticated, and certainly the attackers are. So our whole model is really built around a risk-based algorithm, and we kind of flipped the paradigm and we really focus on the attackers themselves. So everything that we're constantly doing is taking thousands and thousands of suspicious and potentially malicious events, but we're correlating those back to unique attackers. And those unique attackers may have one IP or they may have multiple IPs, but our goal is to really build enough context to understand where are they in the kill chain. And as long as they're early in the stages of discovery and early stages of a kill chain, then we can afford to continue to monitor, play the safety card, keep from generating any false positives, but at the same time building the audit trail so that when we have enough information, we can start to block at the IP level. As they progress deeper in the kill chain, then obviously we're going to raise the risk. But the whole key to our kind of strategy here is that we're not looking at an individual request any longer. We're, obviously evaluating how severe is that request, but what in combination with everything else we're seeing. And that's allowed us to kind of minimize the false positives while still being extremely accurate. And probably equally important, it allows us to really flip the data on its head and start to help our users understand, why did we block these guys? What were they targeting? What techniques were they using? And again, part of the challenge is nobody wants another alert machine. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we see with some of the API vendors out there today is, they're doing a good job of generating a lot of alerts for you to go deal with. But at the end of the day, how do you prioritize and focus on what's the highest risk elements? How do we get those blocked as automatically as we can? And where we can't, how do we get the right set of information in the hands of the security professionals so that they can automate it? And I will take exception, or maybe, I had a great conversation with a CISO earlier today, and we talked a lot about the approach, even all the way down at the container level, since containers are using APIs extensively, and container security is a hot button right now. And you can't necessarily just go blocking an entire API. You've got to make sure that you're understanding you're blocking bad actors, and that's really ultimately what you're trying to do, because nothing kills the security mandate faster than unavailability, because some security policy is causing disruption to normal traffic. So I think that's there's a lot more to it, obviously, but that's the kind of the pillar that we have founded our solution on.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that, Brett, and thanks for the questions coming in as well. Super helpful and helps derive kind of what the audience wants to hear today. So I think this is a really good segue to actually start going into some of the use cases that our team has helped, or our team has seen, and that we've also helped with our customers alike. I'll start with the first one here. So I actually recently here, this was actually over the holidays, what we saw here was one of our large customers that's an online retailer was taking fire from multiple different avenues. As we talked again before about these multi-vector attacks, right? How do you attack an organization from multiple avenues and multiple different points, or vectors, let's call it? And so what we saw here was there was this DDoS attack that was happening on their production website. And as a security team had the solution in place, they said, okay, let's start to look at what's going on here. Let's take a look at the monitoring, the logging, what information is coming back. And they noticed that there was this really high volume of increased login failures. And while that might seem normal because the business is operating during the holiday scene, there would have to be another point of discussion, right, or a point in investigation where we need to dig in a little bit further. And so what was happening here was the goal was actually for that organization or the attacker to actually trigger BGP routing. And so what that was allowing them to do was actually make sure that there was fraud protection, right? So there's mobile APIs, right? When you think of a lot of these organizations, it's not just a website, right? They've got mobile applications that individuals or end users can actually also access their API from. And so the whole goal here, again, was around distraction, right? Can I distract the security team by probing them with this mid-grade DDoS attack to get them kind of bypass on what the real attack point was, which was this BGP routing, to bypass that. And so with ThreatX and our service team, right, again, as Brett mentioned, we're not just looking at like a traditional WAF of a single transaction, right, or matching to a single rule. We're able to look at different characteristics and behaviors and patterns of the attacker and be able to really identify, okay, while this is going on over here, and let's figure out what's going on. At the same time, we also have the technology in place to say, okay, what are they actually trying to do? So we know attackers are becoming more sophisticated. Most people aren't using just a single IP address to attack, or they're definitely not using their IP address, right? They're masking it, they're changing it, evolving all the time to make sure that they're changing the characteristics to evade these technologies. And I think that's kind of when we talk about kind of the best of breed of ThreatX, being able to identify that behavior, identify that to a single entity or an attacker, and profile that and say, okay, let's watch this as it's going through the different kill chain and aspects of how it's trying to, let's call it, penetrate the organization. So with that, we're able to actually identify that attacker entity, and from there, immediately block that. And so again, you'll start to see this pattern as we go through some of the different examples. But again, a lot of this really comes down to, how do I distract the security team? How do I make sure I'm changing up as an attacker, right? I want to change my characteristics and not get caught. But that's when it comes into place of having a good technology, but also a great service behind it, where we can protect customers. Brett, I'm actually going to turn this one over to you. I like this one because this is our friends from down the street, but a gaming company here. But Brett, I don't know if you want to take this one.
Yeah, I mean, this one, I liked this one as well, just simply because we've worked with these guys a long time. They've been a great customer of ours, and as they were launching this new product, especially with the beta customers that they were utilizing, we saw what seemed to be a reasonably benign botnet. We called it a foreign botnet. Again, we don't know where necessarily they're always coming from, but they were pretty successful from a bot perspective at using various evasion techniques, kind of modifying the attack vectors. And again, from a risk perspective, we were blocking at the botnet level, but it didn't seem to be quite as severe as it ultimately turned out to be. What these guys were really doing during that entire time was, really probing the new application that they were launching for the APIs behind the scenes. They were testing the various, capabilities of those APIs, the amount of data that was coming through, what level of authentication and authorization was really there. And to some extent, we were able to identify some of those vulnerabilities, but not all of them were addressed by the time that they actually launched the product. So as they launched the product, that's when we, saw a very large account takeover attack, and similar to the one that we saw, or that Jeremy just described. The biggest challenge in these things is you don't want to block all your legitimate users, but the patterns of behavior look like failed login attempts, or they look like other types of exploitation attempts. And so it took a combination, and this is really where we think this approach of focusing on the attackers, fingerprinting them, using TLS signatures and other kind of key identification characteristics, but also then combining that with what we've seen. Once we've seen a bad actor, we're gonna store that data for a minimum of 90 days. And because this target launch occurred within that window, we already had a pretty well-developed profile in terms of the signatures from an IP perspective, from a user perspective that were coming in, and it made it much, much easier for us to be able to distinguish between who were the more suspicious and malicious users and IPs where we're seeing these failed login attempts versus, the normal just gaming users who may have logged in incorrectly or forgotten their password or gotten frustrated as they banged away, multiple times. And we were able to really support them through a pretty large scale account takeover attack with, several 100,000 IPs coming through at the same time, keeping the legitimate users kind of going through their paces, as well as, blocking effectively at the IP level. So again, it was a combination of techniques, and that's something that, as I described the platform, a lot of competitive solutions or other solutions are kind of a hybrid of acquired products, a different bot solution, a different maybe web application solution, maybe a different API solution. And in many cases, they don't always talk well together. And I think one of the things that we've done, I think, pretty well is been able to feed all of these different contextual data inputs into the single analytics engine that allows us then to parse this information, do the correlation much faster, and be able to kind of join these attacks that are using multiple techniques together and see that in full context. So,
yeah, well, thanks, Brett. And so, as we give a couple of different examples here from our actual ThreatX SOC, and as Brett mentioned, some of the different techniques and tactics that we use to identify, but also proactively block these attackers. For organizations that may or may not be using ThreatX, I think we saw it, and it goes back to that poll where a lot of people don't even know, where their APIs are, what they're doing, right? What is normal? What is that normal behavior? And so it can kind of be overwhelming, kind of be scary, as we talked about. So I guess the next question is, where do we go from here? And so when it comes to looking at not necessarily the visibility of things, but also even an incident response, when you're looking for, as organizations are looking for kind of putting solutions in place or partnering with the right solution, there's a couple different things, as Brett kind of alluded to, that start. I think the first one is really around focusing on the attacker, right? So understanding that risk profile, what is that entity of the attacker doing? Not necessarily just a single IP address or a device ID or a characteristic that's hitting your API, your application, but really kind of bubbling that up and correlating that information to understanding where's the attack vector coming from? How do I evaluate that risk? How do I put potentially a risk score to it? But then also making sure there's actionable data for you to take. One of the things I actually like to talk about is kind of this acronym I call BAD. I think when we look at solutions, one of the first things, and this applies not just to API security, but kind of coming from different security technologies as well, making sure you're putting something in that has the baselining, the B in BAD, baselining the information, understanding what does normal look like? What does the normal traffic look like for my environment? And making sure you have a good understanding, good monitoring, good logging of that flow. The second thing is the A, right, in BAD, which is the anomalies. So when something is off or something changes in my environment, how am I detecting on that? What changed? Do I have the insights into that? And then the lastly is the D, the bad. And the D stands for making sure you can decide, right? Or making sure there's a decision. Do I block this? Do I go and put an allow list? Do I make an exception, right? Is there a risk acceptance policy that I need to put in place because something is core to my business? And so, I kind of give all of our audience viewers that acronym when you're looking not just for API security, but when you're looking for all different technologies within your environment, kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that bad acronym, right? Can I baseline? Does the solution have some type of anomaly detection? And then also from that, does it have the power for me to go and make sure I can decide or act in alone? And so, Brett, I'm not sure if you want to give a little bit more recommendations as well from your point when looking at solution. I know we talked a lot about kind of what ThreatX does, but even from, let's talk a little bit about the shift left side. So when it comes to some of the shift left stuff, where do organizations start? We talked a little bit about visibility, account management, but is there something different maybe from a deployment method or a service that organizations can start from?
Well, I mean, we are always going to recommend defense and layers. And so, there's no disparaging of one approach versus another approach. And I think you have to look at it in that full context. And whether it's doing vulnerability scanning, whether it's some kind of testing program that identifies security misconfigurations or other vulnerabilities that are out there, I think it's always going to be a very important piece of the puzzle for any organization. Challenges obviously are, as you look at all the different application stacks that you have to protect. Most organizations have a pretty heterogeneous environment. They've got different skill levels on the application teams, different skill levels from a security comprehension of those teams. And so, we certainly, from a shift left perspective, are all about ensuring that you understand and have something in place to do to kind of build the pre-production side of the house. My experience, though, has always been that no matter how much we emphasize that, especially from an security side, it's not always the top priority within the application team, and/or there's not always time to deal with each and every vulnerability. And furthermore, you're usually not talking about the 10 or 11 vulnerabilities or issues you got to address. You're talking about the 1,000 issues that you're supposed to address. And while they may be classified, it's a continuous battle, as we all know. And so I think we've always stressed, and part of the reason why we built ThreatX was we wanted to have a solution in place that it was as automated as possible, was as easy to deploy as possible, and quite honestly, could handle almost any technology stack. Because again, the challenges aren't always just your tier one application where all your smart guys are. Your real challenge is the weakest link, and it's that old legacy application or a third-party acquisition or or an acquisition that you've done of software that nobody in the building knows how it's working. And so I think having that 1-2 punch of something that can really be the best at identifying where the issues are, and from a protection perspective, ability to deploy these virtual patches while you give your engineers the time that they need to go and address some of the vulnerabilities. And then, as much as you can, use the metrics and the analysis that you're getting. And in our case, one of the best things that I think that we do is not just the blocking, it's the identifying what's being targeted and the metrics around how many unique attackers are really focused in on those areas, and how many different techniques are they using, and what's the overall risk level in terms of if that was to become the breach point for your organization. Because you're not just dealing with classifications of the types of vulnerabilities, you're now dealing with the real numbers in terms of how many bad actors know about this. And so it's that combination where I think both sides are feeding each other. But I know in my past lives, and the reason why I was so passionate about building a solution that could automate and could add the blocking element in, is because we were always fighting a losing battle. We were always trying to play catch up. Didn't mean that we didn't want to keep doing it. It just meant that it wasn't enough to only focus on the pre-production side. We had to have things, and that's not even going down the rabbit hole of some of the runtime vulnerabilities and runtime attacks that you see out there that are almost impossible to detect from a scanning and from a testing perspective. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. That's great insight there, and it's actually a great segue for our last poll here, which I'm going to open this up. So our last poll is, today, where are you in your API security journey? Is it we're just learning, we're just kicking off, we're gaining visibility? Is it we're kind of to the next stage, inventory is done, and we're starting to scan and we're starting to look at some of the vulnerabilities in there? Or, kind of the next level of maturity is we're starting to monitor, we're starting to log, we've maybe got solutions in place. So I'd love to kind of see what the audience says here in these three different. But, as we're kind of waiting for the poll results to come in, I think, one of the points that you brought up that I think it's also interesting is ownership. So, we talked to a lot of different organizations, and of course, companies are all different shapes and sizes, right? Different industries, different compliance regulations they need to go by. Some have CISOs, some have dedicated application security teams. There's so many different variables. And I think one of the things is when it comes to APIs, when it comes to kind of looking at your risk exposure out there, a lot of times it's figuring out who owns that. And we've seen organizations kind of battle back and forth because, as we know, APIs aren't new. APIs have been around forever. API security is relatively newer, but what we've got is we have vendors that are in this space or different services that come in that can kind of muddy the waters a little bit, to be all honest. And so what happens is you start to see who owns this, meaning, is it the security team? Is it our engineering and development team? I think one of the big things when we talk about APIs is, or even scanning for them or testing for them, is we don't want to slow the business down. And I think, at the end of the day, business is going to start continuing to move at light speed, right? We're going to develop more, we're going to code more, we're going to push out new products. And how do you start to incorporate security effectively without slowing the business down? because, traditionally we've always said, security could sometimes be not necessarily the bearer of bad news, but kind of the stop gates and how we do things, right? And sometimes security in organizations gets a bad rap. And it's like, oh, we got to deal with the security team again. Oh, they're making us slow down our sprint, or oh, we got to move this product offline because we need to fix these vulnerabilities. And so I guess where I'm going at is it's not an easy challenge to fix, right? Again, organizations every different, but starting to have the conversations effectively, right? Including, some of the tips that I always say is if you can start to include security earlier on in the process, you start having the conversations with engineering and development teams, typically the better you're going to be in the longer run, especially as you want to start to put new tools and technologies in place. So with that being said, I'm going to pull up this last poll question here. And looks like we've got just a little bit more than half are still in kind of that just learning or kicking off stage. And it's kind of common to exactly what I said, right? API security isn't necessarily relatively new, but the conversations are starting to happen. And, for better or worse, sometimes bad things almost need to happen for organizations to get a jump start. And, I think we're just 25 days into the new year, and we've already seen a couple major API security, I'll call it incidents that are happening, right? That are affecting individuals. I saw this other statistic recently with Gartner, and it said by 2023, which we're here now, it said 50% of all traffic was going to be an API, right? API based. They said by 2030, that's going to be either 90%, if not close to 100%. And so I think where we're headed is we're going to start to see more and more organizations take API security definitely more serious, because it's going to be the next one. I used to work for an email security company, and years ago, phishing was we all said phishing was the number one attack vector. We're actually, and it's still up there, but we're starting to see that change now, where attackers are going after APIs, right? They're going after your web applications, and a lot of it, again, it's not even necessarily sometimes to get the money from the organization, like a typical ransomware attack, which can happen. But a lot of it is, how do I cause disruption to this business, right? Can I damage this reputation of a company, right? Can I just create a little bit of a nuance, right? Kind of be a pain or a thorn in the side. Never mind kind of what the crown jewels could potentially leave behind an API. Obviously, we saw that with some of the different scenarios of some of the use cases that we went through today. But Brett, I'll kind of leave it to you before we turn it back over to Cody. Not to be the bearer, not to be the bearer of, I say, bad news all the time, but I guess, is there something going into 2023 or even in the future that makes you optimistic when it comes to API security and specifically?
Well, I don't know if I'm optimistic, but I think, we're on the hype cycle curve, as we talked about before. And you said it well. I mean, APIs have been around forever. And even some of the attack vectors that you see, well, there's certainly some different ones. There's also a lot of the same attack vectors, but it's this explosion in the use of the APIs. And it's your ownership question was fantastic, because, by their very nature, you're trying to build a lot of these APIs for reuse. And so, and you may or may not even know who's using the APIs, even if you're the development team. Now put yourself in the shoes of a security team who's kind of inheriting the responsibility without the visibility. And so it's been a challenge. What I would say is, the good news is you are seeing, and there was a question earlier on, which I thought was great, you're seeing just a raft of vendors coming out now with some form of API discovery, API catalog, quick reference points to be able to pick up how, what APIs and what endpoints are being utilized. And then, obviously you can extrapolate from there in terms of identifying the changes and then identifying any kind of vulnerabilities that may become apparent through the usage patterns that you're seeing with those things. So I think that is the good news by all means. And I just think, though, I look at it as a hype cycle, and there's been a lot of different, whether it was endpoint security, whether it was, even the early days of the SIM, you can kind of go through a lot of different variations of various security technologies they roll out. The beginning phases are always, I just want to understand the problem. I just want the visibility to the problem. And then it's oh my God, this is a big problem. How do I automate the problem? How do I, not just get the alerts, but how do I actually, progress into a solution that can provide, some level of protection while still keeping me in the know in terms of what's going on. And I think you're seeing, not just us, but you're seeing other vendors out there really start to tackle the next phase of this problem, which is, let's get beyond just the knowing and seeing the catalog, and let's get into the how do we best provide a layer of protection while still, again, feeding into the whole how do we make sure that we're addressing the underlying vulnerabilities and the code issues at the same time. So I think it's an exciting time. I also think, the progression we're watching is web applications kind of migrating to APIs, and then obviously it's microservices and containers, and it's the whole cloud native application environment. And so these same issues kind of exist along this application component journey across all three layers. And I think understanding the solutions that are out there for each, or are there solutions that are really trying to look at it more holistically and support customers on that entire journey as well. So a lot of great stuff happening in the environment, but as we know, there's a lot of motivation out there for the hackers to try to stay as far ahead as they can on some of these attack vectors. So
that's awesome. No, thanks for that insight, Brett.
Yeah.
So I think with further ado, we're almost at the time here. So Cody, we are going to turn it right back over to you for final words.
All right, Jeremy, thank you. And Brett, thank you so much for joining us as well today. I really appreciate both of you being here. I'd like to remind our audience today that this session was recorded. So should you like to rewatch this program, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the on-demand recording, or you can find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. The winners of our 4 $25 Amazon gift card drawings are Sophie B, Andrew P, Caroline O, and Paul B. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card, but if you don't happen to see that email, please do check your spam folder. I'd like to thank ThreatX for sponsoring today's program, and to everyone who's been with us for the past 45 minutes, looks like. We really appreciate you being here. We really value your time and your feedback. So when we close out, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. Tell us what you liked about our program today, or maybe what you'd like to see on an upcoming one. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at a future TechStrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And Jeremy, Brett, thank you once more.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.